Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm Kirk Varnedoe, and this is the fifth of 6 Mellon lectures this spring on the general subject of abstract art since Jackson Pollock. 2 small correctives. Since lecture number 4, my good friend Ned Rifkin, the director of the Hirshhorn Museum, who obviously knows this period very well, has worked on this, made an important chronological correction to one of my sequences from last thing. He reminded me that Rubber Soul came before Revolver and not afterwards. I misspoke. The second thing I'd like to say is that I believe I've been guilty of false advertising, because with each successive lecture, the field of things I realize I'm not going to be able to talk about becomes larger and larger and larger, and I feel that the correct subtitle of this lecture series should be Narrow Slices of Selected Aspects of Mostly American Abstraction Since Jackson Pollock. Today's title is called Satire, Irony, and Abstract Art. It really deals with the question of good faith and bad faith. We think very much of abstraction, perhaps more than other forms of art, as something in which we need to read an intention that is whole. We need to understand that is meant earnestly, that we associate abstraction with a kind of idealism, that traditionally we think of abstraction as involving a kind of absolutism that doesn't brook of grays but must be black and white. And if we are suspect of idealism, are we then suspect of abstraction itself? Is it necessary that it be ideal and that it be in good faith? This is the subtext of what I want to deal with today, but the way I want to get into it is the subtitle of the whole lecture series. You'll remember that I took the line from Hazlitt's essay on Turner about the viewer who said of Turner's pictures, "Pictures of nothing and very like." And it's the second part, very like, that I want to start with, because the whole question of abstraction's likeness to something, the fact that in fact, though it tries to be a picture of nothing, it constantly could be a picture of something, is one of the Achilles heels that other artists, in fact, who are not abstract painters, have constantly attacked. Let's just start with a little way of getting into this in terms of things that look like things. Here's a wonderful cartoon from the New Yorker a long time ago, which actually has to do with the two-way street that works in art, in that, as they said, there was no fog in London before Whistler painted it, that in fact art makes us see the world differently, and then having seen the world in that way, we go back and see the art differently, so that where Rothko may make us think differently about the evening sky, having once thought about the evening sky, we think about Rothko differently, and therefore the extreme difficulty of ever coming up with a pure abstraction which stays resistant to association and reference. In this sense, abstraction, that is, in being resistant to association and reference, in this sense, abstraction was in fact destroyed, or at least strongly subverted, before it was ever invented. That is, already in the 1880s, a group of artists in Paris who calls themselves the Société des Incohérents, the Incoherents, held a series of exhibitions which produced remarkably premonitory work. In the music side, for example, the Incoherents published a completely blank set of musical bars with no notations on them called Funeral Mass for a Deaf Man, subtitled Grief is Mute. And on the visual side, they had a series of works of premonitory interest. In 1883, under the pseudonym Alphonse Allais, was exhibited a pure white sheet of Bristol paper under the title First Communion of Anemic Young Girls in Snowy Weather. Subsequently, our same friend, Mr. Allais, in 1884, with a piece of fabric, and we have reconstructed these unfortunately lost works, Mr. Allais exhibited this small masterwork known as A Harvest of Tomatoes on the edge of the Red Sea, harvested by apoplectic cardinals. And finally, the pre-Malevich masterpiece and end of abstract painting before it began, Amylé's 1889 Total Eclipse of the Sun in Darkest Africa. Now, these little bits of satire and irony before the fact are then picked up almost as soon as abstraction begins to be born by artists of greater, shall we say, historical stature and consequence. For example, Matisse posited in 1911 in his Interior with Eggplants, this wonderful big work which is now in the museum in Grenoble, a kind of life of art in which abstract pattern, inspired by his looking at things like Persian miniatures and the multiplication of pattern across the surface of them, that abstract pattern could have a life independent of representing anything. So in showing a view of his studio with a still life with eggplants on the table, everything becomes fabric, a piece of fabric hanging behind, and then flowers independently lift themselves off of any association and just begin to pattern the entire surface as if, in fact, it were a decorative textile. And the whole question of decoration is advanced by Matisse as an important form of art which moves one with its rhythms and colors independently of what it represents. A year later, when Picasso was making collages, as Jack Flam pointed out, he purposely went and got a piece of flowered wallpaper with a suspicious resemblance to the patterns of Matisse, as if to say, you want decoration? I'll give you decoration. How about cheap wallpaper? And thus begins a series of sort of thrust and parries between abstract and non-abstract artists in the 20th century, in which the supposedly high, unique, invented forms of abstraction are constantly subverted or demolished by other artists as in fact being perilously close to things that are cheap, commonplace, mundane, commercial, and mass-produced. And this little joke, the same joke that we see happening early on, becomes a kind of staple of pop art, specifically in the hands of Roy Lichtenstein. And here's a Lichtenstein spool of twine from 1961, kind of cheap tabloid advertisement, which has as its subtext its very close relationship to Frank Stella's black stripe paintings of 1959, and is meant precisely to thumb its nose at Stella's pretensions by showing how much the simple codes of cheap advertising look exactly like the kind of high order that Stella is imposing, or even more notoriously and well known, Lichtenstein's compositions book, even thumbing the nose at the idea of compositions, is certainly an amalgam of abstract painting, part Jungermann, but mostly Pollock, related to Pollock's, like particularly the black and white works after 1950, and here's an untitled work on paper of 1951 that'll stand for the rest of them. And this whole snarky and snide relationship to abstraction has an important role to play in pop and its predecessors. That is, it is in a form of an attack art which wants to go against the pretensions of the abstraction that immediately precedes it. Already in the mid-1950s, Rauschenberg had gotten onto this terrain by painting the two paintings Factum I and Factum II, that is, here are two demonstration pieces, in which the apparently spontaneous, casual slatherings of strokes, the gestures, the idea of the spatter, the idea of the drip, all the rhetoric that was so important to the kind of epiphanic uniqueness of the moment in abstract expressionist painting is in fact near duplicated side by side in the two pictures, putting a deep chill on the idea of the unique moment of spontaneity in the handling of material. This same vein of thing is pursued by Lichtenstein even more aggressively in things like the Big Painting, the title itself has a kind of satirical ring to it, of 1965, and many like it, in which he takes the slathering, heated, inimitable signature brushstroke of painters like de Kooning, for example, and shows that it can be codified as if in comics, so that the whole idea of its rhetoric and scale is undermined as being insincere or having the possibility of being codified, freeze-dried, everything that's supposed to be ethereal, ineffable about it, everything that's supposed to be ambiguous to evoke the soul, is shown capable of being die-cut, stamped out, reduced down to literally comic formulae and formulations in the form of these brushstrokes, which Lichtenstein worked a long time to get, because Lichtenstein is in fact doubly interested here. He was interested in the way that these comic conventions for brushstrokes also look like slabs of bacon. They constantly interested him for the interest of how you took something that was formless and shapeless and codified it down in comics. And he admired comics and had a kind of love-hate with their trashiness at the same time that he appreciated their economy and force of conviction in condensing down, at the same time that he obviously had the same kind of love-hate with the big ambition and rhetoric of abstract expressionism. Lichtenstein's satires and irony and ironic comments on abstract art run entirely all the way through his career, and they have at least a couple of different meanings. Here is an entablature painting, for example, of 1974, whose stripes and rhythmic repetitions are a little bit of certainly send up of Gene Davis, of Noland, of a lot of hard-edge abstract painting in the 60s. Perhaps the rhythmic structure at the top has a bit of Judd in it too. Lichtenstein is interested in the sort of stickiness of style, the way you can't get away from the history of style. That is, when you posit a man-made order of geometry, inevitably there is not too far away from it an affinity with the history of man-made orders of geometry in Fret's designs, in Egg and Dart, in all of the architectural vocabulary. And so the entablature paintings are constantly about the close, just tweak the dial a little bit relationship between the apparent neutral emptiness of minimalist painting and architectural reference and reference to a whole history of human invention. That seems to be what's happening in the entablature pictures and in many other things that Lichtenstein does. But the other side of it is a series of paintings of mirrors, like this one of 1971. Here, it seems to me, if the painting on the left says, in essence, all abstraction is in fact representational, that with just a tweak I can show you that no matter how abstract you think you are, you look like an advertisement for a spool of twine, a composition book, an entablature, etc. I think on the other side, on the mirror, what Lichtenstein is interested in saying is the opposite, and that is that all representation is at base abstract, made up of distillations or removals from the imitation of nature that are coded. And that's why he's particularly interested in things like Ben-Day dots, for example, and economical codes of the kind that he finds in comic books or, say, in the ads in the Yellow Pages. And in fact, it's out of Yellow Pages ads, the most degraded, small, tiny things that you can find, Yellow Pages ads for mirrors, that he draws this big series of paintings, often 7 or 8 feet in height, enormous big abstractions, because he's precisely interested in the tension or friction between a completely abstract reductive code of dots and skeins of dots and angles and lines, and how it can conjure up something as ineffable, something as mercurial as reflections on glass, something as intangible and insubstantial, and what energy arises when that insubstantial and intangible thing is made hard-edged and reduced down to a code. So he's interested in two sides of the argument between representation and abstraction, and he doesn't want to let either one of them go. So that often in his painting, like this, he's kind of making fun of the pretensions of simplicity in early modernism by doing Mondrian, the ultimate sort of idealized, divorced from the world, high spiritual, high ideal artist, redoing him again in Ben-Day dots as if he were comic simplicity. It's not a simple jibe, though, because the satire has in it some secret sense of the affinity between the condensation and economy of cheap language in comic books and the drive to reductive simplicity and purity in modernism. So the whole idea of using only primary colors, for example, in Mondrian, is synced exactly with the needs of the cheap printer to reduce down the palettes of inks, so that there is a kind of aggression about this, but also a kind of affection that suggests a kind of hidden affinity or hidden brotherhood between what seems to be the high ideal individual search for a kind of purity and the cheap, crass efforts of an anonymous mass of people to produce codes for representing things. And he sees the dialogue back and forth between these two things as having a kind of circularity. On the one hand, then, he's constantly, in a sense, demoting or bringing down Mondrian by making the high get down degraded into simplicity. On the other hand, he's equally fascinated later in his career in things like this plus and minus picture in 1988 of thinking about how one takes the simple reductive thing and builds back up from it. And here, the simple idea of taking what you call plus and minus, that is, only two variations, a kind of digital, you're either on or you're off, you're either vertical or you're horizontal, exactly the same module, and simply by varying the degree of tint in the thing, beginning to produce something which is atmospheric, which is taken down. In other words, on the left, you take everything that's textured, individual, a so-called atmospheric or personal, and reduce it down to the schematic and industrial. On the right, you're starting from the schematic and industrial and moving back up towards the kind of atmosphere with which Mondrian started in the Pier and Ocean series of 1915, where Mondrian took, in fact, the dazzle of light on open water, the whole sense of the vastness of the sea, and tried to distill down from it a language of essence. What Lichtenstein likes to do is to try to reverse the process, to start with something crude and anonymous and pre-decided and see whether he can push back up towards the subtle, the complex, the mirror sheen, the dazzle of fog and light on water, etc., etc. There's an implied social message, I think, in the satires of abstraction that Lichtenstein undertakes, and it's not his alone. But the quickest way to think about it is to think about one of the ads that we looked at, like the Spool of Twine or the composition book, which is the Cads picture of 1962, which Lichtenstein has said in interviews was specifically intended as a jab at Vasarely. You remember Vasarely as the kind of bête noire of Stella and the others. Here's a Vasarely optical geometrical abstraction of 1959 called Grid. You can see that it involves a kind of intersection of hidden bars in and disrupting a pattern. There's a kind of left to right diagonal and up and down that breaks up this pattern. The reason that Stella and Judd so disliked Vasarely were the pretensions of social order in the idea of his new kind of idealized geometry. The idea that by making geometric abstraction which operated on the optical nerve, Vasarely was claiming to subvert all social differences, to defeat elitism, and to speak to a broad mass of people in a way that made it a radically democratic art. What Lichtenstein is doing by pointing out the potential Vasarely in the sneaker triad, I think, for example, is trying to argue conversely that what he wants is a brotherhood not of neurology, but a brotherhood of what's shared and exchanged, a brotherhood not of absolutes that are hardwired, but a brotherhood of democracy that's associated with the trivial, the commonplace, the tawdry, etc. He looks not to the clinic in a certain sense, but to the souk as the place where we should all get along together. That is, into the tawdry pages of tabloid advertisements as a place where a kind of authentic commonness resides. That what we have in common, says this argument between these two pictures on Lichtenstein's part, is what things are most common to us and the commonplace. And that is a commonplace of negotiation, of the markets, of sale, of commerce with all of its terrible flaws and tawdriness, as opposed to the clinical clarity and totalitarianism, in a certain sense, of the posited idealism of Vasarely's geometry, the found geometry instead, the condensation, the wit, the imagination of the anonymous artist who does the sneaker triad is of more interest to Lichtenstein as a model for the foundation of a society. The same thing might be said at the time of Oldenburg in this fire hydrant of 1969. That is, it's a proposal for an inverted Chicago fire hydrant as a colossal skyscraper, and you can see the little boats sailing underneath it. The Oldenburg is a direct ripoff or quotation of Brancusi's Torso of a Young Man of 1917, an abstracted part of the human form. And in that sense, the Oldenburg seems to be just like the Picasso wallpaper thumbing its nose at Matisse, that is, saying that what appears to be rarefied and the product of high individual thinking can just be found in commonplace industrial products. But I think there's something more going on in this satire, and I think that what Oldenburg wants to do is make modernism come out of its closet and be civic and be public. That is, to take the advances of Brancusi and what Brancusi had done in getting rid of the sentimentality of Rodin, of getting rid of pathos, of getting rid of the idea of a kind of mushy symbolism, of taking sculpture off of its pedestal and putting the pedestal directly on the floor. Those kinds of debunking, stripping ideals are to be re-realized in the fire hydrant, which is very much against the idea of the monument of the man on the horse. It suggests, like Lichtenstein, that the thing around which a society should rally is the thing which is most inclusive, most commonplace, most ordinary, that we are ill-served by idealism, that we are ill-served by symbolism, that we are ill-served by ideals of separating ourselves from great things by pedestals or elevation, that instead we need to recognize a civil side which is about the commonplace, about material life, about the things which are functional, like the things which are commercial in Lichtenstein. This is, in other words, in pop art, in Lichtenstein and Oldenburg, a kind of heroic irony, an irony which posits knowing, skepticism, and cynicism as a positive ideal, in which bad faith is a necessary thing to a good society. And that is extremely hard on abstraction. And that's what these puns are, extremely hard on the ideas of idealism that seem to be wrapped up in the abstraction against which they are punning. So the little jokes in pop are both less serious and more serious in some sense than they seem, admiring of abstraction and at the same time deeply suspicious of it and looking hard at an alternative. But Lichtenstein and Oldenburg are not the only ones. The high prince, in a certain sense, of bad faith, not just in pop art, but in the latter half of the century, must certainly be Andy Warhol. The idea of the original guy who you think is a con artist, where you're not at all sure about his intention, the guy who has found the nerve of the good faith, bad faith problem and is driving right into that nerve again and again like a malevolent dentist. Warhol is to the emperor's new clothes what Chanel was to the little black dress. He may not have invented it, but he's become a spokesman. And so when you have a Warhol crossword puzzle of 1960, what he's certainly sending up and going against is things like Mondrian again, in this case Broadway Boogie Woogie, or Warhol's closed cover before striking Matchbook of 1962, if stood on its side, is clearly a Barnett Newman with its zips and hard edge. And he is just thumbing his nose at the pretensions of high idealism in Mondrian and Newman. And yet, if you look at the Warhol orange car crash that Philip Johnson gave to the Museum of Modern Art, 1964, painting on the left, it's easy to be cynical. In fact, Warhol told David Whitney about this picture that when they bought it, that in fact he just added these big panels of red on the side to make the pictures bigger and more expensive, and that if David didn't have room in the apartment, it was okay to just show the picture with a car crash on the left. Warhol's constantly undercutting his own work that way, and yet having lived with this picture at the Modern, I'm fascinated by the extent to which it uses the forms of abstraction, just as it's minimalism, just as Warhol, in a certain sense, thumbed his nose at the repetition and seriality of minimalism in the Brillo boxes and soup cans, and just as he used that repetition ostensibly to vitiate or deaden the impact of something like a photograph of someone in an automobile disaster, at the same time, one cannot help feeling that the staccato beat of the repetition somehow is not only numbing, but has an emotional effect on us far beyond what the individual thing would be. That is the stuttering sense of repetition, like a flickering film or a TV screen which jackhammer guns this thing at us back and forth, which makes the picture so powerful. And ditto, it is the emptiness on the right-hand side which reinforces and makes that thing more isolated, so that as you are in a tug of war about the impersonality and dead-handedness of this picture, and your same time time reacting to the horrific sense of its nagging insistence on its subject, so the huge red emptiness on the right is at the same time utterly vacuous and hollow, at the same time that it reinforces and makes more powerful by the incursion of that central notch of red, for example, the message on the left-hand side of the picture, and the picture is literally half as powerful, I think, without it. So that Warhol is using and understands, in some sense, part of the language of abstraction at the same time that he's denigrating it and vitiating it. And you find throughout his career that he is obsessed with abstraction. At least as much as Lichtenstein, Warhol is involved constantly in a dialogue with the idea of abstract art, for all that he is represented as an appropriator, as a pop artist. He's constantly nagged by and interested in the model of abstract painting. Perhaps the most direct insult, I would suppose, to abstract painting is in the oxidation paintings of 1977 to 82, like the one I show you on the right, in which he and his assistants literally piss on Pollock. That is, these are large canvases made of reactive copper sulfides in which when you urinate on them, they oxidize and change color. And these paintings are laid on the floor and urinated on constantly by assistants in order to produce the oxidation paintings. The dry version of the wet Pollock are Warhol's series of yarn paintings of 1982, which are skeins of yarn of various colors. These are obviously willfully dumb pictures. They're also sort of smart. I think that, for example, if one were to think about Sigmar Polke's alchemical abstractions of the 80s, Warhol's picture on the left would have a different place in the language of abstract art at mid-century. And something about Stella and Stella's complexity already in the 70s is in the yarn pictures. That is, Warhol was always crazy like a fox. One of the things that he wants to do in these pictures is to press on the nerve of abstraction made easy. The idea that what abstraction requires in order for us to have faith in it is some sense of skill or effort. And this is exactly where he wants to dig the knife in and press hard, in the sense that these seem to be made easy. That is, they seem to be trivialized. They trivialize the idea of invention, they trivialize the idea of individuality. And yet they are, as I suggested about Polke and Stella, sneaky ways of getting a certain kind of painterliness back into the extremely dry and reductive art of Warhol, just as, for example, his camouflage paintings of 1982, and there are a whole series of these camouflage pictures in various colors, offer a backdoor route in which the biomorphism of Arp and Miro, for example, a kind of surrealist language, or Calder, any number of artists, gets back into painting in a different way. Or the Rorschach pictures, and these are huge, like 10-foot pictures of 1984. The Rorschachs get back the scale and bravado of something like Franz Klein or abstract expressionism, the language of Motherwell, etc., brought back sneakily by appearing not to do it. And the whole idea of doing something while appearing not to do it is perfectly likable to Warhol. And there is a pattern in his madness, I think. If you look at the wet and dry versions on both of these things that we've just looked at, you'll see that whereas Lichtenstein tends to be interested in economy and reduction, Warhol is an artist of splish, splash, blot, excess. He's always interested in that kind of spillage and the definition of that by sort of ready-made, hard-edge, crude means, parallel to what Lichtenstein was doing. And perhaps the example one would want to put next to Lichtenstein in terms of the rendering of the ineffable by the apparently mechanical would be Warhol's Shadows paintings of 1977 to 78. There's a long history to be written, which we're obviously not going to do today, about the relationship between photography and modern art, but this would be a key chapter, it seems to me, which would belie the notion, common notion, that photography gave birth to abstraction by starving off painters, that is, in a certain sense, by taking away, by usurping representation. that photography encouraged the birth of abstraction by taking away the task of representation from painters, by starving them in a certain sense. But there's another way to look at the history of photography, and that is that the invention of photography fed not only the language of representation, but the language of abstraction that goes with the coded representation of things. Blur, halation, fogging, solarization, dazzle, grain. Think of all of the abstract aspects of photography that feed an encoded, abstracted language of representation. They've become so much a part of our thinking, the way that light dazzles through a star filter, for example. They almost take them as natural, but they are in fact abstractions induced by the process of photography. And Warhol seems to be highly aware of this and highly aware of the potential. He is as interested in the language of the graininess of photography as Lichtenstein is in the coded evenness of the Ben-Day dot. And the language of the grain becomes for Warhol something like what the aquatint was for Goya. And I don't use the word of Goya lightly. Warhol is the poet, as we saw in the Disaster series, of the morbidity of our time. For all the glitz and glamour, he's constantly an artist who's interested in death and disaster. And just as he is constantly a pop artist, he's also interested in the pure codes of representation, and that comes to a head, it seems to me, in this large series of shadow paintings. And there is an entire room of these things, which will now be on view when the space opens from the Dia Foundation in Beacon, since they own the major Warhol Shadows series. The pictures are 4 or 5 feet tall. They're very big and very impressive. And again, they bring back, in a certain sense, the kind of indeterminacy and broad, big rhetoric of abstract expressionism at the same time that they undercut it. There's a double whammy, a flip-flop to this, in the sense that these are definitely abstractions not. You know right away by their codes that they represent something, and yet they're clearly pictures of nothing. They are, in fact, very much in Warhol's, it seems to me, vein, in that they are grave things. They are emotionally powerful when one sees them. They are grave things about utter hollowness, about insubstantiality. And they won't let go of either side of it. And that's what seems to me so interesting about Warhol's relationship to abstraction and his love-hate relationship with its powers and its weaknesses. In pop art, to sum up, in Lichtenstein, in Oldenburg, elsewhere, and Alex Hay, and people we haven't had a chance to talk about, there's a long-running joke. The joke about abstraction, the joke that abstraction looks like something, the joke of abstraction's relationship to the commercial and real world. It's this joke that turns grim and ideological when we skip over the 70s and get to the 80s. After a decade dominated by conceptual art and installation, when pop returns in things like the Haim Steinbach shelf display of 1986 on the left, it returns iced down, clenched teeth, and without much of a smile on its face. That is, whereas, let's look at another example from the 80s. Here's Alan McCullum's Surrogates, which is a room full of plaster or hydrocal black paintings, if you will, framed black squares. Warhol painted 32 soup cans in a way that played on the intuition that the sale of art had something to do with the sale of commodities, that they weren't too different one from the other. But the way he did it had a kind of snappy, brassy, cheeky, upbeat rhythm to it that stole some of the bright colors and some of the kind of crassness of commerce in order to inject it into the language of painting. Whereas it seems to me what McCullum is doing is stealing a kind of somnolent monotony from abstract painting and injecting it into the idea of commerce. So that the relationship between abstraction and commodity is drumbeat in here in an entirely different way that seems the difference between quip and dogma. And the shelf series on the left plays generally on wall pieces in minimalism and the language of minimalism and the language of display in a way that doesn't have to do with the relationship feared between the power of minimalism and the power of industry, as we talked about before, but the tawdriness of minimalism's slick and its idea of consumer society in such things as toilet brushes and lava lamps. There's a real downbeat feeling, and you would hardly guess for all this that this isn't a period of boom in the American economy. There's, in fact, a kind of secret rebellion going on in here, and that is, if you look, let's look at a couple of other examples, at Sherry Levine's lead knot painting, for example, of the 80s, or a lead check painting by Sherry Levine. The whole rhetoric is of appropriation. And as with Chaim Steinbach, as with McCullum, the idea here is a kind of huge subversion of bourgeois concepts of individuality and originality. And it's across the board. It has to do with a lot of critiques of commodity, and in its sway, it sweeps up abstraction as an undifferentiated example of the investment in the ideals of individual creativity and originality. Sort of secret rebellion is that, in fact, after a decade of unpurchasable conceptual things, land art, installations, etc., these people produce objects which are extremely saleable, which want to be critiques, but at the same time movable and collectible, it seems to me. And they take a lot of the ideas of anti-institutionalism and put them into objects in a way that makes their status in the market, it seems to me, ambivalent at best in the early 80s. But for Steinbach, for McCullum, for Levine, abstraction is something simply passing by in their sweep of bourgeois concepts of myths of originality and individuality. More specific to the critique of abstraction would be Peter Halley. And here are two Halley paintings of 1985. On the left, two cells with circulating conduits, and on the right, a Halley prison with conduit of 1981. Halley is back on the argument that all abstraction is in fact only coded representation, only not in the little joke of Lichtenstein with the spool of twine and the stela, but something much more extensive and serious. And I will, in fact, read you. Halley doesn't like or isn't interested in the ambiguity of abstraction. He would like you to know exactly, and in 1982 he wrote, 1. These are paintings of prisons, cells, and walls. 2. Here the idealist square becomes the prison. Geometry is revealed as confinement. 3. The cell is a reminder of the apartment house, the hospital bed, the school desk, the isolated endpoints of industrial structure. 4. The paintings are a critique of idealist modernism. In the color field is placed a jail. The misty space of Rothko is walled up. 5. Underground conduits connect the units. Vital fluids, in quotes, flow in and out. 6, the stucco texture, and you can perhaps just get that in the painting on the right, is reminiscent of motel ceilings. Parenthetically, I thought many people had positive memories of motel ceilings, but 7, the Dayglow paint is a signifier of, quote, low-budget mysticism. It is the afterglow of radiation. Any questions? Absolute and clear meaning, the meaning being that all abstraction, and particularly the abstraction of hard-edge work like Newman, for example, is coded representation of power. If one reads on and further in Halley's essays, one sees his constant reference to Michel Foucault and the idea of a carceral world in which one is constantly imprisoned. In fact, it's Foucault translated into a kind of neon Monopoly board look, or Smithson reimagined in Dayglow. There's an odd split between the cheery, bright, affirmative positivism, it seems to me, of Halley's work, Halley's colors, Halley's affirmative shapes, etc., that totally belies his sense that all of life is imprisoned, that in fact art, like other things, is a series of conventions which in fact they are done to us, not something we do. That is, buildings, for example, are buildings built to house us, not things that we make to have a view onto the outside world. And there's a deep sense of pessimism in all the cheery upbeatness. Halley's work of the 80s, interestingly, is done before cyberspace, and if you look at his works of the 1990s, he's much more involved. Imagine all of this in the 80s was written before the fall of the Berlin Wall, before the advent of cyberspace, and yet the work continues in somewhat the same vein with somewhat the same set of meanings, now much more complicated and overlaid in a work like this of 1995. It seems that for all that Halley's rhetoric is very much involved with the, say, the world of Robert Morris, Smithson, Foucault, and Baudrillard, that in fact his visual rhetoric is directly out of the world of, say, Gerald Murphy and Stuart Davis. And there's a kind of clash or tension that I think, in fact, makes the work much more interesting and appealing than some of the words and rhetoric that go with it. One of his constant partners in crime, or who's often talked about in the same breath in the 80s, is Philip Taft. And here's a Taft called Madame Torso in Deep of 1984-85. If you could say about Halley, what my friend Adam Gopnik and I said in the High and Low exhibition in the early 90s, that is, Marx once said about history, referring to Louis Napoleon as a pale, farcical imitation of his predecessor and relative Napoleon I. Writing about Louis Napoleon, Marx said, "History always repeats itself. The first time it's tragedy, the second time it's farce." What you see happening in Halley, as opposed to Lichtenstein, for example, is history repeating itself. The first time is farce, the second time is tragedy. In a certain sense, in Taft's case, the farce is continued, but the farce against abstraction, but in a more slightly snide and ad hominem way. The pun here in Taft's case is on Hans Arp and this Dada relief of 1916 called Madame Torso in a wavy hat. Madame Torso, who you can find, I'm sure, if you look in Taft's painting, is now united with the Playboy bunny and put together there, so that instead of just having a separate affinity between commercialized representation in the way that Lichtenstein likes the comics to look like Mondrian, for example, now by putting Arp and his playfulness, and this is meant to be a kind of lyrical, automatic drawing that has a providential relationship to the sense of feminine fashion of Madame Torso in a wavy hat, Taft wants to conflate this sense of individual invention and Dada serendipity with the die-cut sense of the Playboy bunny as a different sense of play. But, you know, the total result of it, and there's one more shape in here, which is really out of Taft's paintings itself, which is this kind of double dumbbell here, vaguely biomorphic double lima bean feeling, which goes with the Playboy bunny and Madame Torso. By putting the Playboy bunny and Madame Torso together in this form, the idea here is not simply a standoff, but a kind of orgy. That is, things get together in a kind of squirming, compacted way, which has a snarky reference, I think, to the masculinity of the Playboy bunny as opposed to Madame Torso. And the title, Madame Torso in Deep, may refer to, as our former President George Bush used to say, in deep doo-doo, one presumes, as the completing of the title. So that the idea of the cartoonish serendipity of the Arp as a part of the tradition of modernism is now made to look the same as a kind of commercial exploiting in the logo form of condensation. Again, the two same interests that Lichtenstein had, reductiveness on the commercial side and reductiveness on the inventive and personal side, made to be leveled in the same, but with an ambition now to produce from the sum total of the two things a kind of decorativeness which is more Taft's signature. Taft's one of the most direct accusers of abstract art in something like this painting of 1985 called We Are Not Afraid. It is a direct replique to Barnett Newman's Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue of 1967, to which Taft argues, we are not afraid. And the argument, in a certain sense, to Newman is, hey, lighten up. That there is, by producing something the same size and the same scale, he's saying, hey, that's not too hard to do, and for all of your arguments about the sublime, I'm going to take this zip, this idea of verticality, which has all of the associations of anthropomorphism, that is the representative of the vertical spirit of human nature in the rhetoric surrounding Newman. It is the one place in the color field painting which usually has a kind of touch to it that vibrates, that gives a human dimension to the flat field of the picture. I'm going to take that, and instead I'm going to make it a kind of braid, which suggests not only that I'm violating the flat space you're so proud of, Newman, but I'm going to say that this is a mechanical sense of what's decorative. So that whereas Halley's argument is that abstraction, like Newman's, is sinisterly powerful, has a hegemony of geometric idealism that's imprisoning, Taft's critique is that it's empty, that at base it's just decoration. And he uses the idea of going back to high decoration to make it low decoration in a different way. So that, for example, he takes an Ellsworth Kelly of 1964 to 6 on the left called Blue-Green and remakes it in his own Blue-Green on the right of 1987. Purposely like sticking decals on it and drawing lines over it as if to exorcise its power. There's a kind of snide, almost graffitiing of the thing one dislikes here, a representation of the imposing nature of the thing that one wants to stick a pin in its balloon and one has to be seen doing it. That is, one's relationship to tradition has to be declared as snide and aggressive rather than simply moving on. But in fact, what one is doing here, it seems to me in Taft's case, is preparing the ground for moving into something which is more personal to him, and that is a form of high optical decoration. The other thing that Taft is constantly ripping off, if you want, or quoting in the 80s is op art and Bridget Riley, and that's the direction he's more headed in. One way to think about this would be not as a simple act of vandalism or as a simple act of quotation, but is in a certain sense an argument for one Matisse over another. That is, he's looking at the Kelly on the left and thinking the big simplicity of Matisse's cutouts as part of Kelly's legacy, the high organization of big, strong forms, and thinking instead about something like the interior with eggplants that we looked at, and Matisse's interest in vibrant, all-over patterning. And in fact, that's where Taft's art is really headed, just as we saw Halley's work getting more complicated in the 90s. Here is a Taft of 1988, 98, 99, in which a kind of grab bag of world decoration, Persian, parts of the Alhambra, parts of Japanese sword guards, parts of Bridget Riley at the top, a whole amalgam to produce a kind of optical overload of sheer visual pleasure, a kind of riot of decoration, which is Taft's more direct side. But he needs to get to it by slaying the demon of what he sees as the abstraction before, whose idealism and pretensions stand against its role, as he sees, as decoration, or the necessity of vitiating or emptying out the idealism in order to get precisely at the empty rhythms and beautiful patterns that he so admires as the energy of abstract art. The issues that these artists are wrestling with in the 80s, the issues of an ironic relationship to abstraction, the issues of a relationship to a powerful model that precedes one. I want to spend the last part of the lecture talking about from another viewpoint. You were looking here at a younger generation, at Taft and Halley, inheriting the world of pop art, for example, inheriting the world of Lichtenstein, Oldenburg, etc., relation to popular culture, relationship to the real-made world, and looking back beyond it to the abstraction of the 50s, to Kelly, to Newman, etc., as pure outsiders, as those who look across a wall at something in which they did not take part. What's more interesting to me are those few artists who come back to abstraction having rejected it, who lived in the immediate descent of high abstract art of the 50s, the generation of Pollock that we began these lectures with, who renounced it and then came back to it through the experience of minimalism and through other aspects of the 60s and 70s. And I'm thinking here particularly of three artists who are what you would call part-time abstractionists. What a weird concept. You would never have had this before World War II. Abstraction was an end point. It was something that you arrived at the end of everything. It was the absolute. Imagine an artist who is only a part-time abstractionist, who does abstraction sometimes and does something else. This is a possibility in the second half of the century, in our time period, that it was not before. And the three painters I have in mind are Richter, Twombly, and Johns. And of these three, certainly Richter is the most programmatic in his relationship between abstraction and representation. An artist who began doing social realism in the Eastern Bloc, and then when he came to the West was immediately taken up with the onslaught of pop art from America, but who has consistently throughout his career painted abstractions of a very particular kind. And here I show you the Richter unpainting of 1972 and Richter's Gray Stripes of 1968. Imagine in your mind a comparison between the unpainting and Lichtenstein's composition book, or on your right, a comparison between the Gray Stripes and Lichtenstein's Spool of Twine. Because just as certainly the Gray Stripes refer to Stella's black paintings of 1959, and just as certainly unpainting refers to gestural abstraction and all-over abstraction in the model of Pollock. But what a difference! Lichtenstein's irony or detachment or distance from the abstraction is to make it more graphic, more clarified, to take all the mystery out of it, all the ambiguity, reduce it to clear, hard, black and white, crude lines, simple pattern commercially. Richter's is exactly the opposite. Instead of making Stella more black and white and cruder, you might say that he literally waters Stella down. That instead Stella becomes grayer, blurred, more aqueous, gets a strange case of the wobblies. The whole sense of order and strictness becomes uncertain, tentative, shaking, etc. And the Pollock vocabulary on the left becomes, instead of clarified and sharpened, messier, thicker, more congealed and clotted. Richter is not a painter of clarification, but a painter of doubt, one who constantly lives with the yes, but. Like Warhol, he is constantly involved both with representation and with the nagging ghost of abstraction, but unlike Warhol, he works into abstraction from the inside as an absolute abstract painter and goes back and forth between the two, between a kind of photographic realism and a kind of abstraction. He comes to his abstraction from a climate of dead cynicism and irony. In his close friends, he counts the artist who used the pseudonym Blinky Palermo, for example. And here is a Palermo from 1969, one of a series of pictures that Palermo did called Stoffbilder, or fabric pictures, literally, in which he takes colored fabrics and wraps them around stretchers to produce pseudo Bryce Martin, pseudo Newman, pseudo Rothkos, whatever you like, simple fabric colors stacked one above the other, or Sigmar Polke, Richter's other partner in crime, often in the 60s and 70s. Here is Polke's picture of 1969 with a pseudo-Kelly composition of the black triangle at the top, but written in sort of typescript below, higher powers command, paint the upper corner black. A kind of dry, heartless, wise-ass cynicism about the nature of the ineffable decisions and ambiguities of high abstract painting. One will not look to Richter's abstraction for anything comforting about its idealism. Here is a Richter abstract painting of 1984 called precisely that, should you be in any doubt, abstract painting. And here is a Richter called 256 Colors on the right, both titles of 1974. These are 10 years apart. Working both sides of the street, geometric abstraction and gestural painterly abstraction, he is equally vitiating to both. The titles themselves suggest generic painting, and the pictures are, like Palermo and Polke in a certain sense, heartless about their mechanical nature. There's something acidulous about the colors on the left. These are very, very difficult pictures to love. One would never look to these pictures for warm and fuzzy sincerity. There is something extremely tough-minded about their relationship to abstraction that makes them of a par with his interest in romantic landscape. Here is his Landscape with Waterfall of 1997. The thing looks so close to the real thing. One so much wants to believe that it belongs in the tradition of Caspar David Friedrich, the beautiful waterfall in the Alps. And then one looks at the slight photographic blur, the unevenness of the thing, the collapse of the space, the sense of lack of definition, the clearly modernist interest in the codes of blur and photographic codes in the same way that Warhol is, that distances, that chills and intermediates, so that constantly one is with Richter in the thing and not of the thing, that one is commenting about it and in love with it at the same time. One wants to participate in the tradition and at the same time doubt the tradition. And this kind of constantly destabilization seems to be what so much of Richter's knowing, calculating art is about. One would think it an extremely unpromising art to produce what it has in fact produced, which is some of the most important history painting and some of the, I think, the most important abstraction of the last half of the century. And I take one specific example within 1 year, and that is the conflation of abstraction and representation that follows on Richter's Baader-Meinhof series of 1988, and I show you one example on the left, and his series of large landscapes, if one can call them that, large abstractions of time with three names, November, December, and January of 1989, and I show you one example on the right. These are 10.5-foot tall pictures, the ones on the right, done immediately following the large series of ruminations on the then 10-year-old suicide death, supposedly, and or police murder of the remaining members of the Baader-Meinhof terrorist group in prison in 1978. This amazing cycle of pictures, which Rob Storr, who also curated the wonderful Richter retrospective that's recently been here at the Hirshhorn and was also at the Modern, Rob brought these pictures to the Modern, and one of the great coups of his career and one of the most important things for the Modern in recent years. This important series, which Richter wanted out of Germany so that it would not be dealt with in the black and white terms of political polarization, but would be seen in a different way that I would think allowed its deep ambiguity to blossom. From the found photographs of police files and tabloids, Richter culled an utterly non-committal, in fact maddeningly non-committal, vision of a series of incidents in the Baader-Meinhof gang's life and demise. One has only to compare a picture like the one on the left to something like Warhol's disaster pictures to see how graphically powerful Warhol's use of grain and the polarization of contrast in photography is, as opposed again to Richter's sense of dealing in the gray zone, in the blur and smear that doesn't make things graphically clear but only makes them more cloudy, so that the emotional range of one's fears, repugnance, idealism, empathy with the Baader-Meinhof gang is forever left in suspension by the cool, deadpan, uncommittal nature of the engagement with the subject and the distance from the subject. The same thing, I think, might be said about Richter's abstractions, and I think particularly about his so-called squeegee abstractions. That is, these pictures, like the big picture November that we're looking on the right, which are made by dragging a hard bar repeatedly across the surface. The whole idea of making a picture out of accident, which was, after all, about Pollock, the idea of letting material determine the image and form of the making, is filtered, I think, in Richter's case, through Jasper Johns, and something we talked about last time, which is the idea, like in this ruler scrape etching of Johns's, the 60s, that destroying order is the same thing as producing it, that creating form involves destruction, that art has a kind of cruelty to it, and there is a kind of raked and ruined surface to a picture like November, which has a Johnsian sense of mordant acceptance of the idea of ruination, scraping, pulling, messing. And the two other canvases have a similar kind of power. This is January on the left, again 10.5 feet by 13 feet, and December on the right. Seems to me clear that Richter is not the producer of a series of 4 seasons. He's not for a clear cycle of completion. It's only winter in this world. It's only about ice and fire, the look of different colors that pepper through are like something that glows through something frozen. These are incredibly rich, complex layers of surface incident, deeply, deeply worked for all of their impersonality, for the feeling that they exist only by a gesture of effacement or defacement or negation. For all of that, I encourage you to think about them or put them next to something like this Clyfford Still, almost exactly the same scale, of 9.5 by 13 feet of 1957 from the Whitney. Here's one of the paradigms of sincerity, one of the paradigms of good faith the paradigms of idealism on the right, of abstract expressionism. And here in the same scale is the man of doubt, the man of irony, and the man of negation. I, for one, find the picture on the left infinitely satisfying and interesting. Tons and tons to look at, deeply moving, powerful. Would sit and look at it at least as equally as I would look at Still's picture on the right. And having walked through a Still retrospective once or twice and seen the acres and acres of empty pony hide that can come out of the formulaic realization of this language on the right, I would gladly trade 52 yards of that for a square foot of Richter's surface. Take another of the triad, and that is Twombly. And think about Twombly's relationship to abstract expressionism, not that of Richter, not that was someone who comes at it through pop or through realism, but who directly comes out of the language of de Kooning and Pollock in a picture like Academy of 1955, but who instead of the continuous liquid skein of a Pollock picture, the big, juicy brushstrokes of de Kooning, produces instead a fragmented, broken, straw-like scratching and scrawling, like, as Peter Sheldall once said, like the kind of thing a dog does when he's trying to get ready to lie down, a kind of destroying the surface, scarring it, drawing pencils through it, a desiccation, a vandalization, and bringing the language of abstract expressionism out of the idea of personal expression into the world of writing and language and shared signs and pictograms, so that at any given moment the picture on the right seems about to break into a set of words, a set of languages, a set of letters that were going to spell out a message, that have a pictogram. They no longer have a kind of independent roll out of the body. Instead, the bodiliness is filtered through the public language of signs, of writing, so that by the time he gets to a very juicy and liquid art like the one on the left of 1963, and this is a Twombly Untitled of 63, by the time the picture begins to spurt and leak and splatter, it is through common signs for phalluses, for buttocks, for fecal material, that everything about its gushiness, its expression, is filtered again through the idea of defacement, through the idea of negation, through the fragmentary spurting, not the cool, beautiful continuity of abstract expressionism, but a kind of jerky, shooting, hesitant, intermittent, hands-on to the canvas negotiation of a set of signs. This kind of work makes Twombly, in the mid-60s, deeply out of step, as one can imagine, with pop and minimalism. And it's only after he undergoes a crisis in the mid-60s that in the late 70s he turns, for the only time in his career, back to pure abstraction, away from the world of language, if not away from the world of writing itself, but writing in a pre-sense, like, as many people have said, the exercises that one did in the Palmer method, where simple rolls were done in order to exercise the hand. It is a willful distraction of writing into the world pre-meaning, before pre-communication, a willfully mindless, run-on gesture that never has any accumulation, never threatens to add up to letters, never threatens to add up to words, has no pictographic component, instead has stripped back from everything that Twombly's work had been into something decidedly austere, even bleak, in its repetitiveness and in its distillation away from the gushy creaminess of his early work into a minimal black and white. These are actually not, they're called blackboard pictures. They're not actually done in chalk. They're done in a kind of white oil stick. Twombly uses this format, this idea of painting, which he has in the late 60s, to encounter in 1970 Henry Gelsaller's great show at the Met of 40 Years of New York School Painting, in which he sees a room of Pollocks. And he goes back to Rome after seeing this and produces two amazing pictures. One of them is the one on the Menil collection on the right, and these are about 13 feet tall, each of them. One is this amazing Menil picture, which has a kind of Wagnerian sense of music to it. Here is a detail of this great tumbleweed at the bottom. Instead of the automatic roll, Twombly pushes this sense of the repetitive gesture out to the scale that Pollock had, where you have to stride into the picture, and begins to produce something like a kind of roll of tangled barbed wire that has these series of breaks or inflections that don't just speak about the wrist and repetition, but speak about the elbow, about the step, that get this huge awkwardness, which is so much a part of Twombly's work, that everything that seems to be easy and repeated has also always a constant sense of slight clumsiness. It's the old "my kid could do it" sense of infantilism about Twombly's work, whether it's in the form of gushing, spushing paint, or whether it's in the sense of this stilted roll of the chalk that's such an important part of not making his work merely virtuosic or facile. But the more interesting, I think, is not this narrative picture. I mean, look at the kind of tentativeness at the top, the musical analogy of the sort of faint sense of faint thunder coming in at the top. Then as you read it down to the bottom, something a little more confused, and then the huge effort of this thing at the bottom, the giant roll of this thing. Look at the difference between that and the picture that the Museum of Modern Art owns, which is utterly non-cumulative, and they think more challenging as a result. More abstract in its refusal to narrate, even by implication, to tell any story. More pure in its unendingness. No one knows where it starts, where it will end, in the Pollock sense of the all-over organization of the picture. And yet done from mere nothing. Done not with the big reach of the ambitious scroll, but with that simple roll, just again and again. How many times can I do this? In fact, practically what's extremely interesting is you might ask how you do this in a painting that's 13 feet tall. By the most artisanal fashion, Twombly sat on the shoulders of one of his friends in order to be carried like a kind of giant typewriter bar across the top of the picture so that he could continue to draw all the way across and then down, and then stood on the floor to do the bottom. Again and again and again, nothing but the simplest, most mindless gesture until it built up in skein after skein into these amazing frenetic clouds. This is a picture, and I would never say this lightly, that I'd look at next to this picture. This is Pollock's one of 1950, and everything that Twombly achieves, he achieves by the negation, by the ironic distancing of himself from Pollock, by the exact inversion of what Pollock is. Everything that is liquid is turned dry. Everything that is light is turned dark. Everything that is simple and spontaneous and athletic is turned obsessive, repetitive, self-conscious in Twombly. By this kind of pressure, by the negation, he realizes on a completely different scale and completely different terms, the kind of intense transmission of energy, the amazing sense of present literalness, of involvement in the exact immediacy of energy conveyed to canvas that Pollock has, translated through writing, through self-consciousness, through irony, into an entirely different kind of abstraction. The final example I want to deal with is Jasper Johns. Johns, too, it seems to me, in a picture like Scent of 1973, is also ironizing Pollock. He is well aware of the overall appeal of a large, unstructured field, and yet he wants to structure it. And this involves for him in 1973, even more than Twombly, the most radical break with his own career. This is the artist of the flag. This is the artist of the targets. This is the man who made his living debunking abstraction, the man who made his name by driving a spike through the heart of Jackson Pollock, the man who established himself as the Antichrist of abstraction. And in 1973, he turns back for 7 full years to painting nothing but abstract pictures along the mindlessly simple model of this system of marks. It is a system of marks that finds its first realization as one of a variety of things in this kind of manifesto picture of 1972, where body parts, like the target with body parts, are then with a found pattern of flagstones, something taken from popular culture, a flat thing, and then on the left, what appears to be a purely invented pattern. Johns has said he saw something like this painted on a car, and that provided the original accent, original inspiration for the picture. What's clear about the picture is that it is a systematization of the idea of gestural abstraction. Its complexity is reducible to modularity. Just as Twombly's repetition speaks of expressionism filtered through minimalism, so John's is about gesturalism filtered through modularity and repetition. It is, in sense, still extremely, for all of its complexity of color, still crisp in its ordering, and it's very clearly planned. If you look at the scheme of Scent, you'll see that it's made, in fact, of a series of panels that repeat itself, so that the edge on the right is exactly the same as the edge on the left, that it's centered on one thing which has on either side of it repeats, that it does, if you can see the pattern, to do A, B, C, and then D, and then overlap itself and go C, D, E, and then overlap itself again and go E, F before it comes back around to the circularity. It's a plotted mental program. It's exactly the opposite of Pollock's sense of automatic release. And it has in it a necessity that one recognizes it is as ordered, that you can't figure out, and you don't need a roadmap to look at this picture in terms of its plan. You know that there is an order to the picture. You understand that it is fragmented, not continuous, that it is plotted. And you feel it in the way that Johns, I think, must have had in mind when he titled it Scent. It's not only the title of one of Pollock's last paintings, though it is. I always think it has something to do with Picasso's statement that there was reality in Cubism, but it was there like a kind of perfume, a kind of odor in the picture. There's a kind of order in scent, but it's something one intuits or sense. The idea of scent, by the way, and I don't mean to subscribe to it, is important to thinking about Johns' series of crosshatch pictures, which he's called, because dealing with their meaning has often involved a kind of title mania. There's nothing to go on in these pictures. They're just thatched arrays of these seeming hatch marks of strokes, and they are, it seems to me, extremely important that they be meaningless in that sense, and yet they are ripe with titles, for example, like Corpse and Mirror, the painting on the right of 1974, of which I show you a detail on the left. Lots of time has been spent with the idea of the exquisite corpse and surrealism, what the mirror has to do anything in terms of doubling. It seems much more interesting to me to look at what's becoming of this simple pattern of scent and how it's becoming now a metaphor of order and its collapse or annulment. What's so interesting in Johns, in that ruler scrape picture we looked at before, to establish an order in order to cancel it. That the important thing about an order is that it be degradable. That the order itself is hardly important, as is the demonstration of its vulnerability or fragility. And the gesturalness that was light and crisp and scent now begins to be slightly more turgid. There becomes, first of all, an austerity in the reduction down from color and a meatiness, especially to the cancellation on the right. What happens is, as Johns works with this utterly meaningless, mindless gesture, as simple and mindless as Twombly's scroll, is that as it works with it, becomes extremely personal. So that you get, by 1974, a Johns remaking, which makes one rethink what those 5 strokes were, what that thing might have been, in that this is done directly with his hand. The hand which had often been like a print in his work, a print of his own body in the work, now becoming the trace of his mark, like a series of caresses, this picture, so that for all of its teeming, knotted congestedness, it's stroked, like one strokes repeatedly the surface of a skin, for example, which is so interesting always in Johns' work, the sense of surface and skin. The personalness of the picture, of the pattern, is never clearer than in the choice of Johns' lithograph here of 1970-71 as his poster for his retrospective at the Whitney. This remarkable lithograph shows 3 things which are about Johns' self-identification. The print of the red arm at the bottom is certainly a direct take from Edvard Munch's self-portrait. Johns' interest in Munch as an expressionist and the morbidity of the Norwegian's work and the whole idea of mortality and the representation of his mortal remains in this Munch self-portrait with a skeletal arm at the bottom. Then the Savarin can in the center is Johns' own sculpture, the remnant of his studio, a Savarin coffee can stuffed with paints which had become a kind of self-emblem. The emblem, like other artists, use a palette for his practice as an artist. And then finally the background, as the crosshatch pictures, in a way that reminds one of the way that Picasso himself put the background in The Girl Before the Mirror as a diamond pattern that recalls the Harlequin's costume. The Harlequin as Picasso's avatar, so that he literally projects his presence as the ground on which his mistress exists. So that in Johns' Saverincan, you have the biological fact of his existence at the bottom, the tools of his trade in the middle, and the things that he creates, the meaningless, mindless pattern of his marks behind him, each one an extremely important part of his personality, each one integral, not to a complete and whole soul in the way that Expressionist painting works, but as the different fragments of levels of existence that creates Johns' self-portrait in this picture. Further on in the 70s, as he continues over 7 years to do nothing but abstract pictures of this pattern, abstract paintings, or Johns' series of pictures called Usuyuki, and here is one of them from the Cleveland Museum, a tall collage and painting in which there's a kind of constant murmur of potential meaning in the newspaper clippings underneath the stroke. So there's a thatch of babbling, a thatch of cut-up meaning that is suppressed and supplanted. The whole idea, again, of burying. And now what had been crisp and aerated in scent, what had been about the sense of something like a smell and odor, now that odor becomes thick, gooey, and melting. The whole idea of the term usuyuki is the Japanese term for a light snow, for something which vanishes and melts in a hurry. And it is a metaphor in Japanese thought for the ephemerality of life and for the ephemerality of beauty. But without title mania even, one clearly sees that as this work has gotten personal for Johns, it has gotten thicker and denser. It has gone from the relatively light feeling of surface and flatness and scent through the greater density now into a kind of melting thickness where the order is not simply canceled on one side as it was in Corpse and Mirror, but canceled in the process of being made, so that the gesture itself is a gesture both of making and burying. And one gets this even more strongly, I think, when one gets towards the end of the series, just before Johns gives up the crosshatch pictures. In 1980, on the left, Dancers on a Plane, number 2, and on the right, Dancers on a Plane, number 1. Think about the aeration of scent and look at the picture on the right. The compaction, the bristling nature. Can you see the central spine of this picture? It runs right up the middle. The picture is actually divided into registers. You can see another register here. And along each one of these spines, the patterns now begin to duplicate. And you get these weird things like birds' faces, for example, with screaming eyes and pointed beaks. And then if you look larger, you think you see jigging arms and legs, as if there's a kind of contortion of exercises going up of things that move in and move out of the spine. And the same thing happens across there. And the feeling is that this pattern has been packed and packed in, that it is so pregnant it is about to crack and yield something. And one can feel almost the storm beginning to happen in the thickening of the marks in Dancers on a Plane 2, where now the color begins to be no longer the systematic exploitation of primaries that we started with in scent, but an eruptive sense of lightning flashes in the dark. Perhaps the great picture of this series, and the one I will end with, is Jasper Johns' Weeping Women of 1975 on the right. Let's deal with the title mania first. It's clearly based on the idea of Picasso's Weeping Women, a series of pictures that led up to Guernica, of which this is the most famous of 1937, pictures of pure anguish and distortion. And there must be, in fact, and there was a show around the time that Johns made this picture, and I think his baptism of it, I don't believe that in any sense the title precedes the picture, but his baptism of the picture must have some sense of the common anguish that pervades the picture and pervades Picasso's series. And an homage to Picasso, an artist always hugely meaningful to Johns, not only for the Weeping Women, but for the cubism, for the systematic organization of cubism that also constantly haunts Johns. In fact, I think if you look at the list of marks and the idea of this sort of run-over of cross-hatching in Johns' picture, there's a definite evocation of the kind of Africanizing relationship between scarification and systematic cubic order that you get in pictures like this Picasso Woman in Bed of 1907, right after the Demoiselle. But forget Picasso, forget the title, just look at the picture. Look at the violation of the picture in the one note of external reality that comes into it, the mere pragmatic thing that hangs around the studio, not the Savarin can as the emblem, but the iron that he uses to heat the encaustic wax that he uses. This pragmatic thing brands the picture in 4 places. You can see that there are 2 irons on a string here and then 2 irons underneath them. As David Sylvester said, in some senses, all of Johns' art is a continual crucifixion, and there's a sense here of anthropomorphism planted into the central panel of this triptych, as if arms stretched and things fell down. But more than that anthropomorphism, it is the actual life of what happens when that iron hits the surface of the picture in terms of its destruction of the order, the pressure against the picture. Think Richter, think the idea of scraping that came out of Johns, I think, in part to begin with, and the idea of creating an order out of destruction. Look at the incredible richness of the drip when the encaustic gives way and runs over the scrape and scratch underneath it. The obsessive working of this surface with personal marks, these circles impressed all over the picture are the bottoms of the ale cans that were Johns' signature sculpture. There's a kind of covert, almost fetishistic imprinting of personal meaning into this unyielding system of abstract lines. And then the lines themselves. Look at the scale of this picture and the rhetoric, how it has changed from scent. Scent now seems like a kind of placid, even landscape. The scale of the marks in relation to the picture, and the picture itself must already be about 5 feet tall. It's huge. It's still in relation to the body, but now built up. These can no longer be the marks of a hand. They have a kind of gigantism in their scale and in their collapse. One could spend an endless amount of time looking at the sheer complexity of layering on this surface, the enormous investment of energy. Think about the feeling from that Twombly. Start with a mindless program, just draw scrawls, and then see what it gives you. Think about John starting with the idea of just hatching, just drawing 5 bars at a time, then drawing them again in oil, drawing them again in caustic, then scraping them down, then trying again, then coming again and again with blood, with night, with white, again and again. Is this abstract art? Is the Twombly abstract art? Are they art about abstract art? Are the Richter big pictures abstract art? Certainly on one level of meanings they are art about art, that their relationship to the tradition of Pollock is tantamount to what they are, and that one level of their meaning is their knowing relationship to that tradition. And that relationship is ironic. It is a relationship of negation, providing structure to the unstructured, drawing out the liquid, making dark the light. It is a relationship to tradition that involves chastisement, that involves the acceptance of tradition's constraints at the same time that it subverts and reacts against it. And yet this is, it seems to me, extremely powerful abstract art. The standard history of abstraction, and the one that the satirists and ironists of the 80s would write smugly and in self-congratulation, is a history of faith in its loss, a history of illusions replaced by knowing, of dreams dispelled by reality. Here, however, in Twombly, in Johns and Richter, you have an abstraction saturated with skepticism, saturated with knowing, an abstraction that proves that abstraction can be knowing and still have meaning, and that meaning is something that adds to rather than only draws on what we know. Thank you.